What was the turning point of the American Civil War? We're going to be looking at 3 battles. Vicksburg, which we haven't talked about yet, but we will. And we're going to review 2 other battles that we've already talked about, Gettysburg and Antietam. Now, remember when we talked about Antietam, that was the bloodiest day in American history. It was a battle that had 35,000 casualties. It was Robert E. Lee's first time that he does not outright win a battle and completely humiliate and beat the Northern Army of the Potomac. So it wasn't really a loss for him, but it wasn't a win, and for the North, that was as good as a win for us. It also allows President Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation that frees slaves in the Confederacy. And lastly, it adds a Northern war goal, and that is to free the slaves. And that is an important part of the Battle of Antietam. Now, Gettysburg, again, we talked about for a great deal of time, so I'm not going to get into this too much. We talked about Robert E. Lee and how he was just beating the Northern Army over and over and over and over again. All of these yellow circles with the black dot in the middle, these are all battles that Robert E. Lee had fought right before Gettysburg, and every single one of them was a victory for the Southerners. Fredericksburg with that horrible stone wall, Salem Church, Chancellorsville, where we didn't really talk about Chancellorsville too much, but it was, if you're a military historian, it's a spectacular victory for Robert E. Lee. These Rappahannock stations and some of these other battles here, again, all victories for Robert E. Lee as he takes his army up north. Actually past the Frederick here is not too far from the Antietam battlefield from the year before, and that's where the Battle of Gettysburg happens, is right up here. Remember, that was kind of an accidental battle where the Southerners were really looking to go get some shoes. He generally wants to end the war by beating the Northern Army up in the north. As you can see, he's actually he's to the north of Washington, D.C. So that was kind of scary. This would also allow him to get food and supplies to his troops, which are that's already a problem for the Southern soldiers. And this is going to be a big deal when we talk about the turning point, okay? Because Southern soldiers went to Gettysburg to get shoes because they didn't have shoes. They were hungry. They were shoeless. Their uniforms were in tatters. Things were their army was looking pretty grim. Now, the battle itself at Gettysburg, I'm not going to get into the particulars since we did that already, but remember that the very first day of battle, most of the fighting happens up here to the north of the actual town of Gettysburg, and Robert E. Lee comes very, very close to almost winning that battle. So he was very excited about that. He could taste that victory that he was looking for to end the war and have the South win. All right, but it was just beyond his fingertips. Second day of battle, it's focused on Little Round Top, and again, he is so close to winning the battle. If it wasn't for the 140th New York Regiment from right here in Rochester, New York, running up the side of the hill of Little Round Top and pushing the Southerners down that very first time, he might have won that particular battle, and that would have been a big issue for the North. All right, day 3, Pickett's Charge. Again, he comes close to winning the battle, maybe not as close as on day 1 and day 2, but certainly that was a huge turning point for the Southerners, especially because they realized that you can't walk across the big open field and have people shooting at you. It's not that the Northerners, when they do it, they're just cowards. They're not. They're just as brave as the Southerners. It's just that with the rifled musket and cannons and grape shot and stuff, that's just it's murder walking across an open field. You can't do that. All right, the results. This is the only time that Robert E. Lee was completely, thoroughly, and utterly defeated in a battle. No doubt about it. He loses a huge chunk of his soldiers. 1/3 of his army, so 1 out of every 3 guys became a casualty. It's the North's only victory against Robert E. Lee, which, again, when we go back to Is it a turning point or not? When you look at the definition of a turning point, this is the only time the Northern Army of the Potomac beats Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. So, I'm not saying yes it is or no it's not a turning point, but that it definitely seems like it would be something that would be something you want to be paying attention to. Gettysburg is the biggest battle in the Western Hemisphere. It was the bloodiest battle ever in American history. Again, it was 3 days long. Antietam still holds the record for the most Americans killed in 1 day, but Gettysburg is the most Americans killed in a battle, and that was over 3 days. And now the Battle of Vicksburg. This is a new battle for us. We haven't talked about this yet. We're starting to answer the questions on the note sheet that you should have picked up in the beginning of class up on the front table. Now, we have to remember from the lessons from previously, especially I believe it was the Antietam battle, we talked about the Anaconda Plan. And the Anaconda Plan is super important when it comes to why Vicksburg is important. Because Vicksburg was one of the last places, if not the last place, that the Southerners could still get things into their country. All right, so the city of Vicksburg was very, very important to the Confederates because of this. It was the, question number one, last place where they could get food and supplies into their country. As you can see, the Northern Army would have controlled, obviously, all the land up in the north. The Northern Navy surrounds the South out in the Atlantic Ocean. But you have this big, huge open area over here where the Confederates can still get stuff, and that's where these Union armies are coming and attacking up and down the Mississippi River. This blue line right here, this is actually Ulysses S. Grant's army fighting down the Mississippi River. There was a navy and an army fighting up from the south, from New Orleans, and Vicksburg was the very last place where they needed to capture so that they could cut off the supplies that would make the Confederacy kind of wither. So now we're looking at question number 2. What are 2 things that make the capture of Vicksburg important to the North? Well, it would complete your Anaconda Plan. This Anaconda snake would then have completely surrounded them, so completely surrounding the Confederacy would be something that would be important to the North. And then, number 2, the North can slowly strangle and kill the heart of the Confederacy. The heart of the Confederacy was always over here, South Carolina, Georgia. Richmond was the capital, but Richmond is where Robert E. Lee's army is fighting all of those. Battle of Antietam, Gettysburg, it's all up over in here. Okay, and that's why we haven't talked about Ulysses S. Grant, because Ulysses S. Grant's fighting 1,000 miles away on the Mississippi River. Now, Vicksburg itself. You can see from this drawing that was done before the Civil War started, this waterway right here is obviously the Mississippi River. Lots of boats on there. You see the steamers and barges and all kinds of stuff going back and forth. The city of Vicksburg itself is kind of unique for that area because that area is really super flat and very, very, very wet. Vicksburg is built on a hill, which was very, very important because up on the top of this hill, you could see everything that went up and down the Mississippi River. And militarily, that's kind of important because if you can see it, you can blow it up. So that's why the North had to have this and the South wanted to keep this. All right, so Ulysses S. Grant, U.S. Grant, has been trying to capture Vicksburg since the spring of 1863. He was, as we've mentioned before, we talked about him, he was a unique character, kind of a lovable loser for many people. He was not the always perfect, always winning Robert E. Lee. Ulysses S. Grant, he always had a much harder fight. It was always more difficult for him, but I think that made him a better man in a way because he fails and he fails, but he's used to it. But he doesn't give up, and that's the beautiful thing about his character. It's not like, oh, I tried one thing and it didn't work, and now I'm going to go home and sulk. He attacked Vicksburg from several different directions, several different types of ways. He's digging trenches and trying to dig canals and running around all over the place. Some people said that it was, he was acting crazy and stupid, but he was really just trying a lot of different ideas to solve his problem, which was to capture Vicksburg. All right, now if you didn't get this for question number 1, Vicksburg is vital to the Confederacy. 60% of all the weapons and food that the Confederacy needed went through the city of Vicksburg. So yet again, you should have an answer for question number 1. Question number 2, 2 things that make the capture of Vicksburg important to the North. Well, to cut off that 60% of the food that's there, and to completely surround the South and to complete their Anaconda Plan. So right now you should have answers for number 1 and number 2A and number 2B. Okay? Now, another picture. This is actually a photograph of the city of Vicksburg. As you can see, it's a panoramic photograph. All right. This is what the Confederacy looked like before. I highlighted everything. Vicksburg's almost square in the middle. When you take Texas into consideration, it's almost square in the middle, north, south, and east, west. So that's what things were like before. I'm going to play a little movie for you guys. Please, again, be listening to what's going on here.
Ulysses S. Grant had been attempting to attack Vicksburg since December of 1862. He wore a lot of road maps and a lot of energy attempting to approach the city. Ultimately, his campaign was brilliant, crossing the Mississippi below the city, attacking the supply line, or capturing Jackson, Mississippi.
After bridging Big Black River on May 17th and 18th, the Union Army arrived in front of the city's formidable defenses.
And then moving down the railroad toward Vicksburg, bringing Vicksburg into a state of siege. That siege lasted 40-some-odd days, from May of '63 to the 4th of July, when John C. Pemberton, the Confederate commander, finally had to surrender.
To minimize his casualties, Grant decided to lay siege to the city. For the remainder of the month of May and into June, he extended his lines until Vicksburg was surrounded. The Confederate garrison was now cut off from supplies and communications. Though the Southern soldiers stood defiant, their strength and resolve weakened with each cut in their rations. By mid-June, tens of thousands of Union reinforcements, requested by Grant to protect his rear, arrived and established the exterior line north and east of Vicksburg. On July 1st, Johnston's army finally marched toward Vicksburg. But it was too late. As his army neared Big Black River, the guns of Vicksburg fell silent. White flags appeared on top of the fortifications. Pemberton met with Grant to discuss surrender terms. The next morning, July 4th, the Stars and Stripes again flew over Vicksburg.
And in so doing, surrendered a very large army, 30,000 troops, plus all the artillery and equipment that supplied that army. Once Vicksburg had fallen, Port Hudson, which was really the last Confederate stronghold, was doomed. Then the United States controlled the Mississippi River from one end to the other.
So as you can see from that movie, the Battle of Vicksburg was not a huge, exciting battle with huge charges and split-second victories at Little Round Top and all these other very exciting things that were happening against Robert E. Lee. Vicksburg was a siege. It was boring. You just surrounded the place and you shot cannons at it until the Southerners ran out of food and they just gave up. It's not really super exciting or anything like that. But by the time the battle is over, the Anaconda Plan is now complete, and on your paper there, and I know it's a little dark on the top there, you have this map. Okay, on the left-hand side it says before, and on the right hand it says after, but the before and the after don't look any different. If you could just go through and draw, it doesn't have to be perfect, a line through there, so you can see what happens with Vicksburg is that it cuts the Confederacy in half. So, you're drawing a line here with your pen or your pencil right through this area, and that's going to be one of the additional things that makes the capture of Vicksburg important, which I didn't mention before, and you can add it in. You can make it like important thing number or letter C, is that it cuts the Confederacy in half. Okay? Now, because of that, the naval blockade is 95% effective in stopping things coming into the South, which means out of 100 boats from England or France that are trying to get stuff to the Confederacy, only 5 of them actually make it through. The other 95 are sunk or have to return. Okay, so what ends up happening is that this part of the South, the heart of the South, you're looking where the cursor's moving, is starting to wither and die. Okay, which is exactly what the Anaconda Plan was all about. That's Vicksburg. After Ulysses S. Grant's awesome victory at Vicksburg, he was promoted to be the head general of all the northern armies. And because of that, his number 2 man, General Sherman, also was bumped up and given a whole nother army, and he fought farther east. All right. Now, General Sherman went on something very, very famously called Sherman's March to the Sea. Now, Sherman's March to the Sea splits the Confederacy again in half. Ulysses S. Grant had split it in half by beating the Confederates at Vicksburg, and then the heart of the Confederacy, that whole eastern part, with Georgia right there, literally by the beating heart of the Confederacy in Georgia, General Sherman marches an army completely through Georgia from one end to the other, taking that half of the Confederacy and splitting it again in half. So you can kind of see how things were working out for the Confederacy after the battle at Vicksburg. Okay, now you got a couple of questions to answer. There's going to be a movie coming up. I just want to review them before you see the movie. Question number 3 on your paper is, what did Sherman's troops do during the march to the sea? Again, be thinking, how did they act? Okay, because they started acting and doing things completely differently. All right, and that is because of something called total war. Sherman's March to the Sea was the first time in world history that anybody had done a total war. And total war is kind of different than what went on before, because before, and if you look up here at the rules, and I took these rules right off of that Revolutionary War paper that I gave you guys. Rules of war, it was considered a gentleman's game, and there was gentleman's rules to the gentleman's game of war. You fought each other in the open, you didn't fight at night, you didn't fight in the bad weather, you never, ever, ever harmed women and children in any way, shape, or form. And if you had no chance of winning, it's okay to surrender. Total war really takes this 4th one down here. Never harm women and children. And it doesn't mean that Sherman started killing, women and children, lining them up and killing them, but all of a sudden, everything in Georgia could be a target. Okay, they realized that burning plantations and stealing and burning food and destroying factories and people's houses and stuff like that was going to be just as destructive as actually shooting and killing Confederates out on a battlefield. Okay, total war. When you go to war, here's the definition of total war: where you go to war against the entire enemy nation, not just the guys that it puts on a battlefield, but everybody. The guys on the battlefield, the people back home in factories, their families, their homes, their loved ones, their animals, their pets, you name it, whatever. That could be of the enemies that you can destroy, you would destroy. And that's what Sherman's March was really all about. Okay, so when you're going through and you're watching the movie, remember, what did Sherman's troops do during their march to the sea? That's number 3. And number 4 is, how is total war different than what went on before? And they'll talk more about that when in the movie clip.
Far from being a wild rampage, Sherman's march, in reality, was a highly organized campaign that reflected the general's deliberate thinking on how to bring a swift end to a conflict that had been dragging on for 3 years.
The March to the Sea is one of the most important events of the Civil War, not only for that period of time, but for right up to our period of time. What the March to the Sea actually does, I think, is it brings a kind of warfare that's been around in other areas of the world, and he brings it to the United States, and it becomes part of the American way of war.
Throughout the first years of the war, generals in the Union Army employed traditional military tactics to defeat their enemies, the Confederates. They often slugged it out with the rebel army by sending in waves of troops. By doing that, the Federals hoped to choke the life and the fight out of the Southern. While their methods were working, the war was being won in a long, slow, and extremely bloody manner. By the fall of 1864, total casualties were nearing 1 million men, killed, wounded, or missing. In Sherman's mind, there had to be a better way to achieve peace, something besides fighting conventional warfare on the battlefield.
He realized that he had to bring the war to the civilians. It was not only two armies against each other and two governments against each other, but two peoples against each other. And he proposed that if you could defeat the population, their will, the psychological effect would be devastating on the Confederate soldiers.
He believed that Southern morale was still high as the war moved into 1864. He believed that both men and women in the Confederacy were quite resolute in their determination to carry the war through to a successful conclusion, and he believed that for the United States to triumph, he would have to break that will of the Confederate people.
To break that will, Sherman intended to cut loose from his supply lines in Atlanta, march his army of 62,000 men through 300 miles of enemy territory, and subsist off the land until they reached Savannah. There they'd rendezvous with the Union fleet. Along the way, they'd destroy anything of value to the Confederacy, anything that aided the rebels' ability to make war. As Sherman's troops moved out, leaving Atlanta in ruins behind them, they began to sing the war anthem, John Brown's Body. Sherman noted that he had never heard the chorus, Glory, Glory, Hallelujah, sung with more spirit. But a Georgian remembered the scene quite differently. Hell hath laid her egg, he said, and right here it hatched. Sherman's march had only just begun, and already he was making Georgia howl. But Sherman's march to the sea would be his most famous campaign. As Sherman departed Atlanta in November 1864, word spread quickly and furiously that he was about to bring the war to every home and hearth. Georgia Senator P.H. Hill told his people, Georgians, be firm, act promptly and fear not. But in reality, Georgians had a whole lot to fear.
There was very little organized resistance to Sherman's march. There were only about 8,000 to 10,000 Confederate soldiers, and that term has to be used very loosely. There were cavalry under Joseph Wheeler, and there was the Georgia Home Guard, not anything like front-rank Confederate soldiers on the part of the militia or Home Guard. Simply not very many Confederates to get in the way of the 62,000 veteran soldiers that were in Sherman's army during the March to the Sea.
Troops set fire to railroad ties, then wrapped the red-hot rails around trees and dubbed the twisted tracks Sherman's neckties. They torched and burned areas of guerrilla activity and called the charred chimneys that remained Sherman's monuments. Even more notoriously, they took the general's orders to forage liberally off the land to an extreme, raiding farms and plantations to the horror of the inhabitants. A Georgia woman complained, like demons they rush in, to my smokehouse, my dairy and cellar, breaking locks and whatever's in their way.
There was an incident very early in the march where Sherman is on his horse going along the road, and he sees this soldier come up, and he's covered with hams and chickens, and Sherman says, "What's going on here?" And the soldier says to him, "Oh, it's liberally, General," and just keeps walking. Sherman does nothing. I think what's at the basis of all this, Sherman is trying to use every device he can to make this point that the Confederacy can't win this war. See what we can do. We can march and we can take anything we want.
But history remembers Sherman's march as much more than a change of base. It was a major change in strategy. By targeting civilians and breaking their will to fight, Sherman made the Civil War a total war.
Okay, almost a year after Sherman's march to the sea, and almost 2 years after Vicksburg and Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee surrenders the last major army in the Confederacy. He does that in April 1865. When Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia surrenders, hint, hint, hint for question number 5, his army was very, very weak because of 2 things. Number 1, they didn't have enough food. They were starving to death. Okay, literally Southern soldiers were starving. They couldn't move, they couldn't walk, and they obviously couldn't fight because they didn't have enough energy, because they didn't have enough food. The other thing, even if you did happen to scrounge up some food, there was the lack of gun parts. Remember that the South doesn't have factories to make lots and lots and thousands of guns and gun parts and things like that. They were relying on England and France to send them stuff through the blockade, and as we know from Vicksburg, that didn't work out really well because of the Anaconda Plan. So those are the 2 reasons right down here for question number 5. Why was Lee's army so weak in April 1865? His army was starving, and it had a lack of gun parts. Okay. Another thing that hurt him and made him weak, but not as much as these first 2, was the prices of everything in the South began to rise tremendously. And we'll be doing another lesson down the road that will be talking about that. Okay. But even if you did have money, you couldn't afford to buy food because the food was just so expensive. This painting here is a very famous painting of the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, where Robert E. Lee finally gets caught by Ulysses S. Grant and has to surrender his army and basically gives up the whole idea of the Confederacy. These 2 guys had fought together, or fought in the same American army, I should say, during the Mexican-American War. Grant remembered Robert E. Lee tremendously. Robert E. Lee was a super famous, all-out, standout guy in the United States Army then, and ironically enough, Robert E. Lee did not remember Grant. Grant was just a lieutenant who had ridden, a horse sideways and hanging off of it, but I mean, he was kind of a no-name kind of a guy. No one really paid much attention to him, and now, almost 20 years later, Ulysses S. Grant is beaten the formerly almost undefeated, except for Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee. So I mean, it was quite a day indeed. Now, expert opinion. Since we're going to be kind of talking about the which one of these battles is a turning point battle, I have some expert opinion. At least in 1 or 2 of the video clips that you guys have seen, you've heard Shelby Foote. He is a Southerner who wrote a enormously successful. It's not just one book; it's a volume of books on the American Civil War. It's very, very thorough. I mean, I don't think there's a single battle that he left out, and he ties it all together. If you like the Civil War, this is a set of books that you want to own. It's very readable, which is nice. It's not like really hard to read, but it does have a lot of stuff in there. Okay, so what Civil War historian Shelby Foote says is that, and I quote, "I think the North fought the war with one hand behind its back." He means that the North was fighting, but they weren't really giving it 100%. There was still so many other things going on in the North that Lincoln allowed. Lincoln allowed settlers to keep moving out west. He was trying to build a transcontinental railroad from the Mississippi River all the way out to California. All of those things are going on while the war is going on. So it's not like down south where absolutely everything came to a halt, 100% effort on fighting this war. What Shelby Foote is saying, the North was going to win this war no matter what. Okay, and this is a continuation of his quote. If there had been more Southern victories, and a lot more, the North simply would have brought that other hand from behind its back. I don't think the South ever had a chance to win that war. And he's, basically talking about the fact that the North had a bigger population, a bigger army, more factories, more railroads, more telegraph lines, more of everything except for cotton, which in the end, you can't kill somebody with cotton. All right, now I wish that you had this graph on something else, but we'll see if I can work this out somewhere down the road. But this is a comparison of a couple of things just between the three major battles that we've talked about: Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Antietam. Number of soldiers engaged. Gettysburg, just a much larger number. Antietam, a large number, not as large as Gettysburg, but it's the same two armies. It's Robert E. Lee's army at Antietam and Gettysburg versus the Northern Army of the Potomac, generaled by whoever happened to be the general at that particular point in time. Vicksburg has the smallest number of men involved, because it was out west, the armies were smaller out there, and that's just the way things went. Number of casualties, okay? Gettysburg is just, bloodbath, okay? Antietam, bloodiest day in American history. Vicksburg, very few casualties, not that, 8,000 plus casualties is not nothing. But I mean, it's not in the Gettysburg or Antietam zone. It was a different kind of a fight. It wasn't a battle on a battlefield between big armies bashing into each other, charging and bayoneting each other in the face. It was a siege. They surrounded the Confederates at Vicksburg and slowly, kind of crushed them. And you can see that down here in the number of days fought. Gettysburg, 3 days. That was an intense 3 days, lots and lots of blood. Vicksburg, a siege. It was 48 days. That's over a month, okay? Almost a month and a half. Things happened very, very slowly. It was not very exciting. There was no Pickett's Charge. There was no, Cornfield or any of the other exciting Burnside's Bridge or the trench that was in Antietam that was filled with the dead bodies. There wasn't anything like that at Vicksburg. It was a much slower, lazy, easy, let's throw some explosives at Vicksburg today and then take a nap kind of thing. Antietam, 1 day bloodbath, horrendous, incredibly intense, okay? So just the difference in times might be something you'd want to think about. Average casualties per day, again, Gettysburg is a 3 day battle, so you have, the average there. Average casualties for Vicksburg, much lower. Okay, unbelievably low when you compare it to the other two. But remember, it's a longer battle with smaller armies. But when you're thinking about a turning point, does that mean that it can't be a turning point because there weren't huge armies fighting? Maybe yes, maybe no. That's something you have to think about. And then Antietam, it was a 1 day battle, so there was, it's the same number there. All right, so in the very near future, you're going to be pulling all this together and arguing in front of, or not really arguing, but discussing in front of the class which one of these three battles you think would be the turning point. You can also pick another battle, but you're on your own on, which other battle in the Civil War you think is a turning point and gathering up the information. I can help you out if you give me a heads up, but, it's got to be with enough time so that I can really help you, not like 2 minutes before class starts. I want to know everything there is to know about Shiloh, Mr. Zerto. Kind of tough. All right, so that's it for this. Make sure you have all these questions answered. Our next class, we're going to go over some of this similar stuff just because it's very important. But this is kind of your background for that Socratic seminar. All right? That's it.